They hadn't seen each other in decades. Old photos decorated the high school gymnasium, now transformed with balloons, string lights, and banners proclaiming Class of '95 reunion. People buzzed with excitement, hugging, laughing, reliving old pranks and romances. Time had aged them, softened some, hardened others, but the cliques were still visible in their eyes. And in the far corner of the room, near the emergency exit and away from the spotlight, sat a woman in a grey pantsuit, her posture so still it was almost military. She sipped sparkling water from a plastic cup and scanned the room like a strategist reading a battlefield. No one greeted her, not out of malice. Most didn't recognize her. The few who might have thought she looked familiar whispered quietly, then shrugged it off. Was that the girl from homeroom? What was her name? Vanessa, Valerie. The truth was, she had been invisible back then too. Always quiet, always reading, always somewhere behind the scenes. People didn't talk to her unless they needed something. And even then, it was usually followed by a joke or an eye roll behind her back. She didn't go to prom. She didn't go to parties. She didn't even have a senior quote in the yearbook. She simply disappeared until tonight. As the music played and small groups formed around the open bar and buffet tables, she stayed where she was, watching, remembering. Her name tag, handwritten in a rushed scrawl, said only Valez. No one connected that to the name splashed across classified reports and battlefield legends. No one connected her to the woman who had once stood before generals and foreign dignitaries, orchestrating operations that never made the news. Here, she was still that same nobody they once ignored. And for a moment that amused her. Then came the laughter. She heard it before she even looked. A group of women, still clinging to their high school hierarchy, had spotted her, whispering, laughing into their wine glasses. One of them, a former cheerleader who hadn't aged with grace or humility, tilted her head toward Valez and smirked. "Who invited the ghost?" she said loudly. A ripple of snickering followed. The woman next to her leaned in and added, "Probably still writing poems in the bathroom stall." Valez didn't flinch. She had faced worse. She had been mocked by teenage girls and threatened by warlords. Between the two, she'd take the warlords any day. They were more honest with their cruelty. Still, a flicker of memory touched her. The girls who'd laughed at her in the hallways, the boys who'd stolen her notebooks and filled them with obscene doodles. The teachers who overlooked her even when she raised her hand. Her survival had begun there, in those long corridors filled with fluorescent lights and social landmines. This was her first battlefield in a way, and now she had returned to it. The music changed. A photo slideshow began projecting on the gym wall, photos of awkward teens in acid-washed jeans, school dances, science fairs. And then, like a cruel joke, there she was. A blurry shot of her, sitting alone in the cafeteria, head down in a notebook. The caption read, "Valerie Valez, quietest student alive." The room burst into laughter. The MC tried to make it lighthearted. Hey, at least someone was studying, right? But the damage was done. She stood slowly, not in anger, not in shame, with poise. Her body moved with discipline, her eyes scanning the room like she'd done 1,000 times before. And that's when they noticed, the way her shoulders squared. The way silence seemed to form around her as she walked. Something had changed. She wasn't the girl in the photo. She wasn't the butt of the joke. Something was different now. Something they couldn't quite name. She walked past them and out through the gym doors, into the open field behind the school, without a word. And then came the thunder. The ground trembled first, then the noise, low at first, then rising like a roar from the heavens. People ran to the windows. A few stepped outside. That's when they saw it. Black, sleek, unmistakable. A military helicopter descending from the sky, kicking up dust and dead leaves. Doors opened. Soldiers stepped out, flanking both sides of the ramp. From the chopper, a man in uniform jogged toward her. "Ma'am, General," he said, saluting sharply, "we need you. It's urgent." The silence from the gym was complete. Not a whisper, not a breath. The woman they mocked had vanished long ago. What remained was someone else entirely. someone they never really knew. Long before she stood under rotor blades and salutes, before classified missions and command briefings, Valerie Valez was just a name on a class roster that teachers barely noticed. She was born in a neighborhood where hope was scarce and silence was survival. Her mother worked 2 jobs and still came home exhausted, sometimes with bruises that told stories no child should ever have to decode. Her father was gone before she could form complete sentences. Violence wasn't a shock in her world. It was routine, normal, background noise to the sound of sirens and shouting. At school, Valerie never raised her voice, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because experience had taught her the cost of being seen. Quiet was safer, so she observed, she listened. While others wasted energy trying to fit in or climb adolescent hierarchies, Valerie studied everything: people, patterns, reactions. While they mocked her in gym class, she memorized the way their friendships shifted, the way lies spread, the way cruelty moved in packs. These weren't just social dynamics to her, they were data. She spent hours at the public library while others went to the mall. She pored over history books, biographies of leaders and revolutionaries. She became obsessed with control. Not the kind of control that came from force, but the kind that came from discipline, strategy, patience. She read Sun Tzu's The Art of War before she turned 15, and something about its calm ruthlessness made sense to her. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, she'd underline over and over, as if engraving it into her bloodstream. When she turned 17, she enlisted in the military. She didn't tell anyone, not her teachers, not her classmates, not even her mother. She simply signed the papers, took the tests, passed them all, and packed her things. The day she left, no one at school noticed her empty seat, but the military noticed her presence immediately. Boot camp was brutal, not because of the physical demands, she had already grown used to pain, but because she was forced, for the first time, to be seen, to follow, and eventually, to lead. Her drill sergeants mocked her silence, her small frame, her unreadable expression. But then came the evaluations, tactical drills, simulations, leadership trials, and again, she excelled. She wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but she was the smartest. She saw 3 moves ahead when others were still figuring out what was in front of them. They started to call her the Ghost, not because she was weak, but because she appeared where no one expected, made critical decisions before chaos unfolded, and left behind nothing but clean results. But it wasn't all triumph. The ghosts of her past still followed her. There were nights during deployment when the echoes of shouting from her childhood apartment would creep into her tent. There were moments in the dark when her body still remembered the panic of hiding from her father's footsteps. She never spoke about these things. She simply woke up earlier than everyone else and ran, miles and miles, as if she could outpace the trauma clinging to her lungs. It was during her first overseas mission, humanitarian aid in a politically unstable region, that she tasted real danger. Her unit was caught in a crossfire between 2 factions, pinned for 12 hours with no contact. When their captain went down, it was Valerie, then only a sergeant, who took command. Not because she demanded it, because the others looked to her without needing to be told. In the chaos, she stayed calm, issued orders, saved lives. No panic, just precision. When the extraction team arrived, they were shocked to find every soldier accounted for and a tactical perimeter already established. That moment changed everything. From that point forward, her record became something whispered about in briefing rooms and advanced training centers. Her name moved up faster than usual. She never asked for medals, but they came. She never gave speeches, but recruits quoted her. She didn't have charisma in the traditional sense, but in a crisis, her presence was grounding. The kind of presence that said, if she's here, you're going to make it. But underneath the growing titles and the increasing responsibilities, Valerie never forgot where she came from. The cafeteria tables where she sat alone, the bathroom stall where she ate lunch to avoid being mocked, the sting of laughter that could pierce deeper than bullets. And in a strange way, those moments gave her more than pain. They gave her purpose. Because leadership, she learned, wasn't about speaking the loudest. It was about listening hardest. It was about standing still when everyone else panicked, about making decisions no one else wanted to make, about remembering the invisible, the forgotten, the ones in the corner. She would go on to be called General in rooms full of men who had never heard her speak in high school. She would lead missions that never made the news, negotiate peace where diplomats had failed, and carry the weight of lives on her shoulders. But it all started with being overlooked, forgotten, laughed at. And that's why, when the reunion invitation arrived, she didn't hesitate. She wasn't going to confront them. She was going to remind herself how far she'd come. It was supposed to be a standard operation. Secure an outpost, deliver supplies, establish communication with local forces, and pull out within 72 hours. That was the briefing. That was what command had outlined, neatly, on paper. But as Valerie Valez would learn many times throughout her career, paper meant nothing when the jungle was on fire and the air itself felt like it was conspiring against you. The operation was classified under the codename Silent Summit, deep within a conflict zone that hadn't officially existed on any map. The region was controlled by fractured militias, some political, some purely violent, and intelligence was murky at best. Satellite images couldn't confirm who was friend or enemy. The local populace had been forced to evacuate weeks prior, and the terrain was volatile, both politically and environmentally. Landslides, hostile wildlife, unmapped minefields from previous wars. Captain Valez, she'd only recently earned that rank, was deployed with a team of 20, including medics, engineers, and combat-trained linguists. The plan was simple. Secure the abandoned radio tower on Mount Erish, re-establish comms with a lost drone surveillance unit, and evacuate within 3 days. She didn't trust the simplicity of it, and she was right. They reached the summit on day 2, after 12 hours of ascent through brutal terrain. The tower was intact, though dormant. The surrounding jungle was too quiet, the kind of silence that's not peaceful, but watching. Valez had that feeling again, the one she'd first felt as a child in the hallway when bullies whispered behind her back. That sixth sense that something was coming. It began at dusk. The first explosion hit the west slope, an IED rigged to a buried radio box. It took out 2 engineers instantly. Within seconds, they were surrounded. Not by amateurs, but by professionals. Well-armed, trained, and using terrain to their advantage. They weren't just trying to scare the team off. They wanted to erase them, permanently. The commanding officer, Major Lenz, was hit early. A sniper's bullet took him through the shoulder, severing his collarbone. His scream echoed through the ravine, followed by gunfire so thick it felt like the sky was falling in pieces. Chaos erupted. Medics scrambled. Radio equipment failed. The enemy had jammed their frequency. The team was stranded, surrounded, cut off, and then, without hesitation, Valez stepped forward. She didn't wait for orders. She gave them, not out of ambition but necessity. People were dying, and she had trained her entire life for this moment. While others ducked for cover, she moved. She memorized enemy patterns between gunshots, marked positions, and issued commands in short, surgical phrases. Suppress North Ridge, 5-second burst. Relocate med tent behind second ridge. Eyes on thermal scan, east perimeter. Her tone never broke. She never shouted. She never paused. In the darkness, she moved like shadow. Quiet, deliberate, unafraid. 2 hours into the siege, her team was not only surviving, they were organizing, executing flanks, laying traps, defending, and slowly the tide began to turn. At 0300 hours, a second wave of enemies breached the outer perimeter. Valez knew their only chance was to draw them in, to create a false vulnerability. She assigned herself the role of bait. Wounded and bleeding from shrapnel in her arm, she climbed to the exposed ledge above the outpost and lit a flare, revealing herself entirely. It was suicide, unless her calculations were right, and they were. The enemy shifted, exposed themselves, and her team, hidden below the ridge, opened fire with precision. The ambush was neutralized in less than 5 minutes. At dawn, reinforcements finally broke through. The team had held the line for over 10 hours against overwhelming force. Not one civilian casualty, not one unaccounted soldier. The mission, once doomed, became the most successful extraction in that zone in over a decade. She didn't sleep that night. She stayed up cataloging the wounded, organizing transport, recording oral testimonies for debriefing. When command arrived on site, they expected to see devastation. Instead, they saw a battlefield turned into a command center, structured, clean, efficient. They saw a young officer standing upright, arms bandaged but eyes sharp, already preparing for the next engagement. That day she was no longer Captain Valez. She was Sir. After Silent Summit, her name circulated in halls where few women's names had ever been spoken with reverence. Internal reports marked her as exceptional under fire, strategic beyond rank, and leader material, immediately eligible for accelerated command. One general called her a ghost with a backbone of steel. Another simply said, "She doesn't break." But what no one ever saw, what no report recorded, was the private moment after her team was safe. She walked out to the edge of the summit alone and stared out into the mountains. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply closed her eyes. And for the first time in years, she felt the quiet not as isolation, but as respect, as recognition, as something she had earned. That mission didn't just change her career. It changed the way she viewed herself. It wasn't about revenge for a past life or validation from the people who had mocked her. It was about something deeper. She had become exactly what no one believed she could. And from that day forward, no battlefield ever felt unfamiliar again. The ceremony was grand, as these things tend to be. Polished uniforms, polished speeches, and a backdrop of fluttering flags under a sky too blue to feel real. Journalists snapped photos. Military brass shook her hand. One by one, they stepped up to the podium to speak her name with honor, a name that had once meant nothing in the echoing halls of a high school gym, General Valerie Valez. She stood silently as medals were pinned to her chest, honors she never asked for, recognitions she didn't need. She accepted each one with grace, nodding politely, her face unreadable to everyone except those who had bled beside her. And then she left. No interviews, no book deals, no farewell tour of podcasts and press junkets, no memoir ghostwritten by someone who had never seen war. Just a signature on a resignation document, a firm handshake with the chief of staff, and an early morning flight to nowhere in particular. The silence that followed wasn't just noticeable, it was unsettling. Heroes don't usually disappear. They're celebrated, paraded, studied. But Valez didn't just leave the stage. She erased the blueprint of how to find her. No one even knew which continent she settled on. Rumors flew that she had taken a post at a private military firm in Dubai, that she was consulting for black ops teams in undisclosed locations, that she'd become a recluse on a mountain somewhere in Chile. No one had facts, only fragments. The truth was far simpler and far more difficult to understand. She left because she no longer believed in the myth of the uniform, not the mission, not the soldiers, those were sacred, but the system, the politics, the performance. After all the missions, after all the lives saved, after all the precise decisions made under fire, she had realized something horrifying. It wasn't enough. There were still meetings in glass towers where men in suits made choices that undermined everything she had bled for. Soldiers she had mentored were being reshuffled like chess pieces by people who had never seen war. Her voice, once powerful on the battlefield, was drowned in bureaucracy when it mattered most. She had spent years building strategic infrastructure, only to see it sold, delayed, or dismantled for reasons no one could justify with a straight face. It wasn't disillusionment that drove her into silence. It was mourning. She had spent her life fighting for something real, and now, standing in a war room made of screens and suits, she felt more invisible than she ever had in high school. The real enemy wasn't always outside the wire, it was the indifference within. So she vanished. moved to a place where the only sounds were wind and waves, where no one called her general, where the stars weren't stitched into her jacket but hung over her porch at night, reminding her what silence was supposed to feel like. Some nights she would sit alone with a bottle of scotch, listening to the static of an old radio tuned to dead frequencies. A habit, a ritual, a way to remember the weight of voices that had once crackled through her headset in the heat of battle. She never talked about the past, not even to the few neighbors who dared befriend her. They thought she was a widow, or a retired professor, or just a lonely woman who liked dogs and stormy weather, and she let them believe it. Not out of shame, but out of peace, the kind you only earn when you stop trying to explain yourself. It wasn't until a former soldier found her, by accident or maybe fate, that her story began to rise from the fog. He was young, freshly discharged, haunted by something he couldn't name. He'd heard stories about her from old recordings. He didn't come seeking help. He just happened to cross her path in a small coastal town where he thought no one knew his pain. But she did, and for hours over bitter coffee and long silences, she listened, not as a superior, not as a therapist, as someone who had been to the edge and made it back with scars invisible to the naked eye. Word began to spread, quietly, respectfully. Others came, not many, just the ones who needed to. She never advertised, never claimed a title, never asked for attention. But in that silence, a new form of service was born, one without medals or ranks, one without commands, just presence, wisdom, and the kind of listening that could keep someone alive. She had disappeared from the world not to hide, but to become something it no longer knew how to value. A witness, a soul who had seen too much, lost too much, and still chose to remain soft enough to care. So when the reunion invitation arrived, delivered months late by a postal system that didn't quite know where she was, she smiled. Not with malice or irony, but with curiosity. She didn't owe anyone there an explanation. But maybe, just maybe, she was ready to step into the noise again. Not to prove anything, but to remind herself that she could. And so she circled the date, packed nothing but one clean suit, booked a one-way flight, and prepared to walk into a room full of people who had never seen her, not really, ready to become invisible one last time. Until the moment came when invisibility would no longer be an option. It started with a tremor, barely noticeable at first, just a faint vibration in the floor of the gymnasium. People were too wrapped up in their conversations and cocktails to pay it any mind. The reunion was reaching its peak, drinks flowing, old photos passed around, a slideshow looping awkward teenage memories on the far wall. The laughter was loudest around the open bar, where the same voices that had once filled high school hallways were now louder, older, more brittle with age. No one noticed her leave. She'd been sitting alone most of the night near the exit, like an observer to a play she once performed in, and then forgot. They hadn't recognized her. Not really. A few had muttered half-remembered names. One of the cheerleaders had giggled when she thought no one was looking and whispered, "She still looks like a substitute teacher." Another one had added, "I thought she was dead." She'd simply risen from her chair and stepped outside, not in anger, not in shame, but with quiet purpose, the way she always did. Her shoes touched the wet grass behind the gymnasium, where the soccer field lay in silence under the moon. Her hands were folded behind her back. Her chin was slightly raised. To anyone watching, which at the time was no one, she looked like she was simply getting air. But then came the sound. A low, rhythmic thumping from the distance, dull at first, then louder, sharper, undeniable. Conversations inside faltered. Some laughed nervously. Thunder? Someone guessed. Generator failure? Another muttered. But she didn't flinch. She knew the cadence by heart. It wasn't thunder, it was rotors. The tremor returned, now shaking drink glasses and rattling the light fixtures. Guests began to drift toward the exit, curious. Teachers, former students, spouses of classmates. They spilled outside into the dark, blinking against the sudden wind. Leaves blew sideways, dresses flapped, Phones went up, capturing what would soon go viral before they even understood what they were filming. A black helicopter was descending. It wasn't a rescue chopper or a tourist ride. It was a military-grade UH-60 Black Hawk, sleek and humming with suppressed violence. Its blades kicked up dust and debris in every direction, forcing people to cover their eyes and step back. A few screamed. Some thought it was a mistake. Others froze entirely. And then, from the side of the aircraft, two figures in full tactical gear descended the ramp. One of them, tall, clean-cut, dressed in command fatigues, walked briskly through the wind, straight toward her. He stopped just a foot from where she stood, snapped a perfect salute, and said the words no one at that reunion would ever forget. "Ma'am General, we need you." It was said loud enough to be heard over the blades, but it echoed louder in the minds of everyone present. All at once, the crowd turned, dozens of faces pale with recognition, confusion, disbelief. They looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. She hadn't changed her posture. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't spoken a word. But now they saw what they had missed. The stillness of a person trained to command under fire, the sharpness in her eyes, the weight of something earned the hard way. The former quarterback, now balding and awkward, stumbled forward. "Wait, you're General who?" She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. And then, finally, she spoke. "Valez." The name landed like a punch. Someone whispered, "She's the ghost general from those news leaks years ago." Another said, "My brother mentioned her in training, said she ran black ops in Eastern Europe." Whispers turned to murmurs. The silence that followed felt almost sacred, and then she walked. She didn't explain, didn't justify. She just moved with the precision of someone who didn't need permission to lead. As she stepped toward the helicopter, the soldier beside her updated her on the situation. It was urgent, complicated. She nodded once. She boarded, the doors closed, the wind doubled. And then she was rising, above the field, above the reunion, above the decades of silence and mockery and underestimation. Inside the gymnasium, the music was still playing, but no one was dancing, no one was laughing. They just stood there, rooted in place, watching the sky. For most of them, that night would become the most unforgettable story they'd ever tell. Not because of the music or the photos or the drinks, but because the quietest girl in school turned out to be something none of them could have imagined. A legend in plain clothes, a hero hiding in the corner, a ghost who had never needed their approval to become powerful. And for just a moment, they understood what true presence feels like. Not loud, not dramatic, but earned. That night, the sky closed over them again. The dust settled, and she was gone. By the time the helicopter disappeared into the night sky, the reunion had changed. Not just in tone, but in temperature. Like the air itself had been rearranged. People slowly returned inside, but the chatter was quieter now. The music that once sounded nostalgic now felt hollow. Jokes no longer landed. Old rivalries, rekindled earlier in the evening, faded into irrelevance. Because all anyone could talk about, whether out loud or in silence, was her, Valerie Valez, the girl no one noticed, the woman no one could ignore. Some guests left early, shaken. Others stayed, replaying the moment over and over, trying to make sense of it. A few searched her name on their phones, only to find most of her career was sealed under government clearance. What little existed publicly was cryptic. Unnamed missions, classified commendations, speculation. But what caught their attention most were the testimonials, snippets from soldiers, journalists, and diplomats who spoke of her not with reverence, but with awe. They didn't call her a hero. They called her essential. Yet no one knew why she had come back to that reunion at all. What had she hoped to find? Closure, revenge, or just a quiet corner to disappear into again? None of those things. In truth, her return wasn't about them. It was about her final mission, not in war, but in memory. Because what haunted her most wasn't what she'd done in battle, but what she had carried in silence for so long, the assumption that her past had no value, that her history, the cafeteria tables, the whispered insults, the years of invisibility, was something to be buried, not understood. But returning to that room, surrounded by people who had once looked through her, she saw something unexpected. She didn't see enemies. She saw children pretending to be adults. Insecure teens who had grown into insecure adults. Some had softened, some had hardened, some carried their own silent wars behind their smiles, and she realized they weren't laughing at her anymore. Not because of the helicopter, not because of the uniform, but because they had finally seen her for who she truly was. And it startled them. Before boarding the chopper, she'd done one last thing. She walked up to the reunion sign-in table, picked up a pen, and wrote something in the guest book. Just a few lines, no name, no signature. The organizer would later find it and wonder who had left it behind. It read, "Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it watches, and sometimes it walks straight through the storm without asking for shelter. The quiet ones remember everything, and one day they lead." That was her message. Not vengeance, not a performance. A reminder that every person in that room had underestimated someone once. That judgment is often loud and understanding is quiet. That leadership doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it wears silence, and sometimes it returns. Not for validation, but to reflect the mirror no one dares hold up to themselves. In the days that followed, her appearance sparked more than gossip. It sparked change. One of her former classmates, now a school administrator, started a leadership program for girls who felt invisible. Another, a struggling veteran who hadn't spoken about his trauma in years, reached out to a support group. Even the class president, once smug, always polished, sent out an email to the entire alumni list with a single question: who among us did we overlook, and why? No one heard from her again after that night. There were rumors, of course, that she was seen in Ukraine, coordinating field hospitals, that she was advising a refugee network in Turkey. One report claimed she was in Antarctica, researching isolated psychological conditions for deep space mission candidates. But none of it was confirmed, because that was never the point. The point was, she had left her mark, not through speeches, not through ceremony, through action, through presence, through the kind of moment that rearranges what people believe about strength and who carries it. She didn't need the reunion needed her. And in that one night, without a single "I told you so," she taught them all the most important lesson of her life. The world underestimates the quiet ones, until the moment it can't afford to anymore. If you found this story inspiring, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because sometimes the quietest voices have the strongest stories. What moment in your life made you realize your own strength? Let me know in the comments below.